So we can be deformed by what's happening in the workplace. We can be formed away from God unconsciously by what's happening around us in the workplace. Or we can actually be a little more proactive about what we do and how we do it. And that's what we're going to do for the next hour. I'll talk for a while and tell you some stories about people who are acting against these forces that deform us. And then you're going to have an opportunity to just have a bit of a practice of some of those spiritual disciplines. And once again, I just want to say that if you're thinking about work, think about the different contexts that you're in. Don't ignore the different contexts that you're in. Now, why spiritual disciplines? Why are they important? They're important because our work is important to God. God cares about our work. We talked about that earlier. Because work is where we do God's work. This is the place where we're actually living out that stewarding of God's creation. And when we say things like God sustains the world, part of the way he sustains the world is actually through our work, our ordinary work. Work is how we honour and worship God. We want to worship God through our work, not worship work itself. Work is where we are spiritually formed. It's where God can actually shape us and change us. And also, we need to be formed for our work. We need to be equipped for our work. I'd love if every church was able to do that effectively and efficiently, but often our churches don't seem to be able to do that well. So here are ways that you can actually work with God to equip yourself for work. So I'm going to talk about 6 disciplines, and these are in my first book, the Blue Book. I'm going to talk about holy working, gospel working, prayerful working, incarnational working, spirit-empowered working, and social justice working. 6 different ways we can think of, 6 different disciplines that we can take into our workplace to act against those deforming forces that Matt was talking about. So we're going to go through each one by one. The first one we're going to talk about is holy working. Holy working. So holy working is actually taking on the character of God. It's trying to learn how to live out that character in our workplace. I remember there was one person I was talking about faith and work, and I talked about holy working, and she said, well, that's so obvious. And this is probably the message we get all the time as Christians. We are to be that person in the workplace who is holy about how we work. We're supposed to be pure. We're supposed to be acting in ways that are godly in our workplace. So we get that. We recognise that. But what does that look like in practice? It means working hard and well. It means being loyal to the people about us. It means encouraging a focus on values and principles. Many workplaces have value statements. We can really align ourselves with the value statements that we think match biblically and are godly in the way they are. We can celebrate the good. We can look around and see what is good, what would God smile at, and how can we actually affirm that and celebrate that. It means dealing with the difficult stuff, the hard ethical issues, and standing up for those things. And it also means trying to minimise exposure to temptations in the workplace. And that's the story I'm going to tell you about. The story is about my friend Beth. Beth works for a special effects company in Melbourne, Australia, but it's actually linked to a company that is here in LA. In fact, when I went to visit her workplace in Melbourne, it was so cool because they had this camera there, and we could look right into the office in LA in real time. That was pretty special. Then I realised the camera for Melbourne was pointing right at me, and I felt a little self-conscious, but anyway. So Beth worked in this workplace, and they worked on the Marvel movies. They did special effects for Marvel movies. This is my favourite Marvel character, Groot. I am Groot. Anyway. And so she worked on those films. It was a really exciting environment to walk into. I love visiting people in their workplaces, and this one was just like amazing, seeing all the visuals up and all the stuff that was going on. Beth told me about a time, what they used to do is they used to get the advance print of the movies, and they used to get to watch the movie first. And so they were screening the latest Marvel movie one night, and they had a great time, and, they'd be pointing out each other's work and joking about it and all this stuff. The movie finished. it was lovely. They were just going to have some drinks and celebrate together. And then this may be quite shocking for you. It was a little shocking first time she told me. But she said then someone put a porn movie on. And she was shocked by this. And she went up to the person who put it on and said, "Turn that off. Why are you putting that on?" And this person said, "Oh, don't be a killjoy, we're just having fun here. This is just normal, just go with it." Anyway, she continued to be sort of upset that this was going on in the background. So she just went up to someone else and she just said, "I want that off." And they said, "No, it's not going off. We know you're a Christian, but, other people are just having fun. Don't spoil it." And so she just packed up her things and went home. On the Monday morning, she went into work and she had an appointment with the HR director. And she said to them, "I want to talk about what happened on Friday night with that porn movie that was on." And the HR director said, "Look, there's nothing we can do about it. It was outside work hours." And my friend Beth said, "No, but it was a work function. It was a work function. It was on work premises. I just don't think that should be present there." Anyway, it was a little bit of toing and froing. The HR director basically was saying, this has got nothing to do with you and you're just trying to spoil fun and all that stuff. Anyway, Beth realised she wasn't getting anywhere. And so her final words were, "I think it's a work health and safety issue," she said. And Beth explained that she had not felt safe in her workplace. She said, "I feel really uncomfortable about that." Anyway, Beth got up and left and just thought, well, that's it. She actually thought for a moment, maybe I'll lose my job for speaking up or whatever, but she thought basically she'd done what she felt prompted by God to do, which is speak out. A couple of hours later, she was invited back into the HR person's office and she thought, right, they are going to sack me. And she sat down and the HR person said, "I was thinking about what you said about feeling unsafe in your workplace." She said, "I don't want a workplace where anyone feels unsafe." So she said, "So I thought about it," and she said, "I can guarantee you that will never happen again here." What Beth was doing was holy working. She was standing up for something that she thought was important. And frankly, she found out later, she was actually standing up for a whole load of other people who felt uncomfortable about what had happened, but didn't have the guts to speak up at the time. So that's holy working. The next one is gospel working. Gospel working is, yes, it's about proclaiming the gospel, but it's also about standing up for biblical truth in all the different ways that might be expressed. I've got there the images of salt and light, and that's something we can really aspire to, isn't it? We can be light in the workplace. If you've ever been in a really dark place, you put on the light, you just see the darkness go to the edges. And that's what we would like to be in our workplaces, isn't it? That all the darkness that we see around us would just go away if we can bring Christ's light into that place. And salt of the earth. Salt, I've heard this described as, adds flavour. Yes, I like that. It preserves value. But it says salt of the earth. And something I discovered that in Palestine, salt was actually a fertiliser. And so part of what we can be is fertiliser in our workplaces. We can create environments where people can flourish. I think that's a really great thing to aspire to. So gospel working is trying to live out the truths of the Bible, being obedient to that. It's trying to integrate biblical knowledge with our working. I know a guy, he's a consultant, he actually does design work for companies. And what he does is he takes Genesis 1 and the description there about creation, and he actually uses those principles that he sees there of separating out and then filling in, and he applies that to his design work in companies. So he's actually applying biblical truth in a really creative way in what he does. It also means defending truth. I see all truth as God's truth. So if you see some sort of truth that's been spoken against or some sort of lie being promulgated, then it's good to stand up for that. It means doing the things that we're probably familiar with, linking up with other Christians. Employee resource groups are a fantastic thing that's happening in big corporates these days, where there are Christian resource groups that actively are in Google and a whole load of other big companies, Facebook, Salesforce. And Christians can meet together there and encourage each other. I think they're fantastic. And basically it's about seeking any opportunity you can to either proclaim the gospel, if you get the opportunity to do that, or promote the gospel in some way by what you do. So let me tell you about Phoebe. Phoebe worked for a big organisation. She was the Asia Pacific manager for this big organisation. And every now and then the CEO would come and visit them in their office. She was in Perth on the west coast of Australia. Anyway, one time her CEO had come to visit and she had to sort of do some work in her office. So she just invited the CEO to just stand in her office while she was finishing something off. And the CEO was looking, and all around her computer she had these Bible verses. And as she was typing away, she became conscious that he was actually leaning in and reading all these Bible verses. Anyway, he was reading them and he said, "Where did these come from?" And she said, "From an ancient sacred text." And he said, "Oh, that is so cool." And he said, "Oh, we've got to do something with these. What can we?" He said, "Can you get these and get them like done up in calligraphy and make big posters out of them?" And she said, "Absolutely." So Phoebe took them and she got them. They were verses from Proverbs and Psalms, and she got them made up. She got them beautifully done up in calligraphy, and she put them in frames, had them done up beautifully. The CEO just thought they were incredible. And he said, "We're going to put these up in our boardroom." So he did. He put them up in the boardroom. And Phoebe said she got such a kick. Every important meeting that happened in that place, every important meeting with a client, every board meeting, every staff meeting, they were surrounded by biblical truth because it was wisdom from an ancient sacred text. That's great. So that's a fun example of gospel working. Another one is prayerful working. One of the things that really surprises me is how few people pray for their work. How few people pray as they go to work. How few people pray while they're at work. How few people pray after work. I think prayerful working is something that we can do to shape our hearts. We just pray through our work. And part of that is actually cultivating an awareness of God's presence at work. I have a friend called Angela, and she used to think that she had to take God to work. It was almost like she packed God in her backpack and she went to work, and then she let God out every now and then. She'd say, "Oh, I went to church on Sunday," close the backpack. So her sense was that she was responsible for taking God to work, and she felt it as a burden that was hard. But God is everywhere, isn't he? God is present in your workplace. You just got to find out what he's doing, becoming more aware of his presence in your workplace. I think prayerful working is about trying to create these rhythms of rest and silence and solitude at work. Those things might seem hard. Matt was just talking about, the hustle and grind of busy workplaces. Can we somehow create a sense of rest in the midst of the busyness and the rush? Is that possible? It's about bringing everything before God. Yes, the times we do tend to pray is when we're in trouble, right? We desperately need help. But can we do it during the good times as well? Can we celebrate all the good things of God that we see around us in the workplace? Can we celebrate achievements? Can we celebrate truth when it's spoken? Can we celebrate goodness? Can we celebrate the beauty around us? Can we celebrate wonder? Can we celebrate joy? The example I want to tell you about is Lou. Lou is a manager of an emergency department in a hospital in London. And this story I found on the web, on YouTube. I think it's still up there. Lou Adams. She talks about a time during the pandemic in London. It got really bad for a time there, really serious, lots and lots of people getting really seriously sick. And one time she talks about in her emergency department, just as she was about to start shift, she looked out the door and she could just see this whole lineup of ambulances there, all the way down the street. And her heart just sank. And she knew that lineup meant that there was a possibility that people would die in those ambulances before they even got in through the doors into the emergency department. Like, people would die of things that were preventable just because they were so crowded and overwhelmed. And at that point, she just said she had to pray. So she found a space and she prayed to God. And she just said, I don't know what you can do, Lord, but whatever you can do, can you just make it possible for us to get through this and that no one die unnecessarily of something that we could actually heal in here. So she prayed that prayer. It was a prayer of desperation. Then she took a deep breath and came out to start work. And she said the whole shift was amazing. She said nothing went wrong. Everything went smoothly. People were diagnosed quickly of what was going on, and then the care was provided. And it was so amazing. It was such they were in their sweet spot and everything was going really well that her colleagues were mentioning it too. They were saying, wow, isn't this a great shift? This is going so well. And she was saying, yes, because I prayed to God. God is doing this. And then at the end of her shift, she looked out the door. No ambulances lined up for the first time in weeks. It was incredible. And she said she just realised the whole shift, she'd just been carried by God through this shift, and she'd just seen God at work, which does raise the issue of why did she not pray before every shift like that? But I think that particular shift, she just felt this sense of just laying it all before God, surrendering it to God. There was nothing she could do in her power to change the situation. It needed God. Prayerful working. The next one is incarnational working. There we have a beautiful photo of Mary and Jesus and Joseph. Of course, it's not an actual photo of them, but what I like about this picture is, it takes away that sense we have of this sort of perfect moment, perfect child. Mary looks tired. Joseph is full of wonder. Jesus is probably going to cry, unlike what we sing about Away in a Manger. Jesus cried, okay, he was a real baby. But Jesus was incarnate. In other words, Jesus was God and he came to flesh. He took on flesh. And Jesus says that he took on flesh to show us who God is and what God was like. And in the same way, we can incarnate Jesus. We can be Jesus with skin on. We can show people who Jesus is by the way we act. In fact, for many of our workplaces, we will be the only Jesus they ever meet, the only Bible they ever read. So how can we do that? We can look for these metaphors of creation and faithfulness and redemption and salvation and provision and grace. We can look for these little ways that we can show people parts of the gospel message, the God message. We can think about what would Jesus do and how can we react to those around us? How can we serve those around us and just show them a little of who Jesus is and what he's like? We can see that our workplace could actually be the source of modern stories about Jesus. I had a friend who was actually asked by Dolby to tell the whole staff about what Easter was all about. They said they have this practice of people explaining holy days, and so they asked him to describe Easter. And so he went on to give this address to the whole of the staff, and later he found out the whole of Asia Pacific, it was recorded and sent on. He basically told the gospel, but he did it in a way that incorporated things that were familiar to the people in his workplace that they would understand. So how can we look for those sort of stories? Let's give you an example. This is an example of David. David is a handyman. I know him well. I'm married to him. Anyway, David told me this story. We have a handyman business, and he told me this story one day. And as his business manager, I was a little disappointed in parts of the story, but I'll explain it to you. So he was sent out to visit this place. He was supposed to do a quote. He'd been told by the real estate that there was a problem with this place. It had a mold problem. He turned up at this place and he found the person who lived there was this elderly woman. And talk about a mold problem. Like, she took him into her living room, her lounge room, and all across the ceiling was mold. And there was worse mold in the bathroom. The mould problem was so bad, she actually had in-home care from nurses, aged carers. Well, they had stopped sending nurses and aged carers to her place because they said it was a work health and safety issue. They said they couldn't risk their people getting sick by coming and spending an hour with her. She was living in this environment. When David went in there, he realised that, yes, there was a mould problem. Yes, that was a health and safety issue, but he knew there was a bigger problem. She hadn't spoken in the presence of another living person for 3 weeks. So he realised there was a more important thing that he should do. So he said to her, "Can we have a cup of tea?" She was delighted. So he sat down and she sat down and they had a cup of tea together and they talked for an hour. This, as the business manager, is the thing that really upsets me. This was supposed to take 15 minutes, this quote. He spent an hour in conversation with her, asking her about herself, and she chatted and chatted, and he could just tell she loved being able to speak to another human being sitting across. And then, even though he was supposed to just do the quote and get it approved and all that, he realised he wanted to take action straight away. So he started getting a whole load of the mould off in the living room, so at least in that place where she sat a lot, it'd be more comfortable. He arranged to go back 3 times. Again, this was just a short job, but anyway, he went back 3 times, had 3 more cups of tea with her, and finished off the job. And I joke about being upset at him because actually that's exactly what Jesus would do. Jesus would sit down and talk to a lonely woman. I remember the times when Jesus would allow himself to be interrupted as he was going to an important person's place by a woman who was bleeding for 12 years. He allowed himself to be stopped and to talk and encounter that person. So what David did was incarnational working. We've just got 2 more to go through and then you'll get a chance to practice some of these. The next one's spirit-empowered working. One of the things I think that is sort of amusing is the way that we think that spiritual gifts only operate when we're in church on a Sunday. How about spiritual gifts actually being active wherever we go, whatever context we're in? We need to be spirit-empowered for our work and to access and utilise the gifts that we have wherever we are. So we need to discover our spiritual gifts, and some of those gifts make a lot of sense in the workplace. If you've got the gift of leadership, the gift of teaching, the gift of serving, the gift of generosity, those things can easily be expressed in the workplace. But I would also argue that some of the supernatural gifts we really need in the workplace as well. We need prophets who will speak up. We need people who have a word of knowledge in the workplace as well. I joke that my friend who's a translator does have the gift of tongues, but all of these can be expressed in the workplace. We need to pray for opportunities to partner with the Spirit. We need to acknowledge that God's presence can be felt in the workplace, sometimes through us, sometimes in spite of us. And also, wherever the Spirit is present, there is always transformation, right? So we might be part of a transforming movement in our workplace, enhancing the workplace environment. Let me give you an example. Mish. Mish was doing this really cool thing. She's an entrepreneur and she starts business after business after business. And one time she had this idea to start this business, get these Christian creatives in. Their business is called Told, and it's about telling the story of organisations. So that was her business. And she had the thought that what she would do is not just teach these young creatives business skills, that was her dream, so they would become self-sustaining as a business. She also wanted to teach them spiritual formation, because her theory was that if we could do spirit formation intentionally while we were growing the business, that actually the millennials would have spiritual growth at the same time. It was nuts actually. Those young people grew so fast. It was incredible. It really worked well. This idea of intentionally doing spiritual formation in the workplace was just fantastic. Well, she invited me in as sort of a spiritual formation consultant. So I would go in once a week and I'd run a session. And because they were creatives, I always tried to make sure I did really nice slides with really good pictures. Anyway, I was going in this one time, and when I arrived, I had, my package all ready to go. And she said to me, Cara, she said, I was praying this morning and the Holy Spirit prompted me, and I don't want you to talk about what we talked about you doing. She said, I want you to talk about boundaries. I think they really need to hear that right now. Personally, I was a bit upset. I had all my stuff prepared, I could talk about boundaries, but I didn't have any slides. And I was a tiny bit resentful of being asked to do this. But anyway, I thought, I better do it. So I just started off, and we started this session, and we were talking about boundaries, how they could apply boundaries better. And oh my gosh, the conversation just took off. It was an unbelievable time. You could just see that, God at work in the conversation. And there were tears, and there was laughter, and there was deep stuff being shared. It was amazing. And at the end of the session, I had to agree this was exactly the right topic at exactly the right time. And if I tried to do the other thing, it wouldn't have hit nearly as hard. So I had to apologise to Mish afterwards. And I said, I doubted the Holy Spirit and you, but that was wrong. And I had to say to her, if you feel prompted by the Spirit, speak up, because, that's the right thing to do. That's Spirit-empowered working, just responding to that prompting that you feel of the Spirit. And the last one is social justice working. Here we have a picture of Jesus turning the tables over in the temple. Sometimes I've heard people preach on this, and a little part of me dies when they say, and this is why we should separate out money and work and church and worship. They should be separate. And I go, I don't think that's what's going on. What's actually going on, if you read that, is that Jesus is standing up for justice. Where those tables have been set up in the temple was actually the court of the Gentiles. It's where God-fearing Gentiles could go to the temple to try and worship God. And they've been crowded out of it. And the other thing that was happening, you see if you read that passage that there are doves flying. The doves were a concession by God for people who were poor. If you wanted to bring a sacrifice to the Lord, you could sacrifice a dove, because a dove could be caught anywhere in Israel. You could catch doves and then you could make a sacrifice. So it was for poor people to be able to make sacrifices. But here what was happening was doves were being sold at inflated prices. People were being robbed. So it's a justice thing that Jesus is doing in that place. And we can do justice stuff in our workplaces as well. Particularly, we know that Jesus had a real eye for those who are vulnerable. So in your workplace, who are the vulnerable? Maybe it's a work colleague, maybe it's a customer, maybe it's a supplier. Who's the person that you can look out for? How can you agitate for fairness, as Moisha might say, in the workplace? How can you look for those places that where people are experiencing injustice in some way? How can you express compassion in your workplace? How can you advocate for sustainability? Justice is not just for people, it's for the planet as well. How can we advocate for that? So just to give you an example of this, I want to tell you about my friend Rowan. Rowan works in the fruit and vegetable business. And he loves to go out to farms and visit farmers and see what's happening there. And one time he went out and he went to this place, this farmer. He grew potatoes. And this guy was taking Rowan all around the farm. And at this one place, they came to there was this big pile of potatoes. And Rowan said, what's happening here is this crop that's going to be sold. And the farmer said no. And the farmer said, everyone now wants A1 grade potatoes. He said, these ones have little deformations on the skin, so they're not acceptable. Rowan said, so what happens to it? And the farmer said, well, we'll plough some of them back into the fields, but most of it, that's just waste. That's waste. This massive pile of potatoes. Well, Rowan had just put in a really expensive chip French fry machine. And so Rowan thought, and he said, what's underneath the skin? Like, is the flesh still good? And the farmer said, yeah, it's fine. It's just these imperfections on the surface. So Rowan said, how about I buy them off you? So he named a price, they worked it out. The farmer was delighted. He was waste crop that was now going to be sold. Rowan was delighted because he got it at a cheaper price than A1 grade potatoes. But it put Rowan on a mission, and he started going around to all the places that he supplies and finding out what was the crop that wasn't being used and how could he actually take that and use it. This meant that there was less waste product. It was something of an opportunity for farmer and for Rowan, but it also meant there was less waste of food, good food. So it was a justice issue as well. So there you have the 6 ways of working. If you go to your book, what we're going to do now is have an opportunity for you to practice some disciplines of this. If you go to page 19, you'll see a whole series of exercises. For holy working, you get to practice something called the Examen, an ancient prayer that you can actually practice. It helps to grow your awareness of God at work. If you're interested, what you could do is gospel working. At the bottom, page 21, you'll see the spiritual discipline of Lectio Divina. It's a practice of reading the word out loud and then just meditating on God. On page 23, it talks about prayerful working, an opportunity to pray like Paul. Yes, we can all pray like Paul. It's crafting a prayer using any of these prayers that are there as an example and thinking about your workplace and how you could contextualize it for your workplace. From page 24, you'll see incarnational working. I've got a list there from David G. Benner, the Christian psychologist, and he names a whole load of behaviours that Jesus did. How can you grow in those behaviours in your workplace? For spirit-empowered working, on page 25, you'll see that you could actually go to a website that helps you discover your spiritual gifts, and then you can think through how you could actually live that out in your workplace. And on the same page, there's the spiritual discipline of journaling for social justice. Have an exercise where you're having a conversation with God on the page, writing out, where are the vulnerable in your workplace? What could you learn from? This is an opportunity for you to be shaped a little by these spiritual disciplines as you think about your work. There's a bonus one on page 27. I have a podcast called Worship on the Way to Work. And on Monday mornings, you can listen to a little worship service that prepares you for Monday. It's the bridge between Sunday and Monday. And in that, what we do is we have a call to worship, we have a Bible reading, we have a reflection, we have a prayer time, we have a call to action, and then we have a benediction, a sending out. You could actually design your own little worship service that's particular for your workplace and your work context. So there's some opportunities, some ideas for how you can do some spiritual disciplines to prepare yourself for work. We're going to give you about 15 minutes to work on that now. You'll probably only get the chance to do one of them, so maybe choose one. Maybe choose one you haven't tried before if you're familiar with some of them. But have a go at doing one of those spiritual disciplines, and then we'll come back together in a moment. Thanks.